as kind of a prototype ship for the Nippon Yusen Kaisha line, or NYK line in Japan, that would be used to revamp its cargo fleet. The Tsushima Maru was built in Glasgow, Scotland in 1914 by Russell and Company. Her keel would be laid down in the same year, with the yard number 666 at the Kingston Yard in Port Glasgow. Named after the Tsushima Island located off the coast of southeastern Japan, the ship would be launched on the 8th of September 1914. Weighing at 6,754 tons, the ship was 445 feet long, or 136 meters, with a beam of 58 feet, or 18 meters. Powered by triple reciprocating steam engines going through 2 screws, she could reach a speed of 8 to 10 knots. The ship would be fitted with all the auxiliaries for a first-class cargo ship, being supplied by David Roman and Company in Glasgow, Scotland. The Tsushima Maru would be completed in December 1914 and would enter service in the same month. She would have a long career, spanning throughout the pre-World War II years under the NYK line. On the 21st September 1941, the Japanese Imperial Army took over the ship and was given the designation IJA number 886, primarily using her as a troop transport. She would deliver troops to strategic points wherever reinforcements or mobilization of troops was needed. Reports on where she went during the early years of the Pacific War, as well as her pre-war voyages, are scarce to say the least due to reports either not being translated or just not being preserved. In 1944, the Ryukyu Islands, the southernmost islands of the Japanese archipelago, was at risk of an invasion due to the rapid Allied advance that occurred in the latter half of the war. Cargo and passenger ships were used to transport evacuating civilians to mainland Japan. On July 7, 1944, the Japanese government made the decision to evacuate residents of Okinawa, as well as the Amami Islands located in Kagoshima Prefecture. The Tsushima Maru would be one of these ships, carrying both troops to the forefront, as well as carrying civilians far from any potential combat zone. While cargo and passenger ships like the Tsushima Maru worked to evacuate civilians and transport troops, the Allied forces relied heavily on submarines to disrupt enemy supply lines and gather intelligence. Ordered on the 15th of December 1941, the USS Bofin was the third of the Below-class submarines. The submarine would be constructed at the Portsmouth Navy Shipyard in New Hampshire. Traditionally, submarines were named after fish and aquatic creatures, ranging from fish to marine mammals, with the Navy designating these vessels with names inspired by, quote, fish and inhabitants of the deep. USS Bofin was no exception, being named after the bowfin fish found in the Great Lakes and the Mississippi River. Known for being a primitive, aggressive, and ravenous fish, it conducts sneak attacks, primarily at night, into shallow waters to stalk and prey on fish. The Bofin's keel was laid down on July 23, 1942, and construction proceeded smoothly. Just 5 months later, on December 7, 1942, exactly 1 year after the attack on Pearl Harbor, she was launched from the Portsmouth Navy Yard. This timing earned the Bowfin the nickname the Pearl Harbor Avenger. After her launch, Bowfin underwent rigorous sea trials to ensure her readiness for combat. These trials consisted of her performance and capabilities, allowing her crew to familiarize themselves with her systems and range finding. Her complement consisted of 10 officers and 70 enlisted men. These trials included submerged operations, depth charge exercises, and maneuvers designated to evaluate her speed and agility. Successful completion of these tests solidified her status as a formidable asset in the fleet. Weighing 1,526 tons on the surface and 2,414 tons submerged, USS Bowfin spanned 311 feet in length with a beam of 27 feet 3 inches. She was powered by 4 Model 16 278A diesel engines, each producing 1,600 brake horsepower, manufactured by General Motors. Her power system, comprised of General Electric 2-wire direct concurrent generators, providing 1,100 kilowatts of power. Bofin's storage batteries included 2 Sargo-type cells, each containing 126 individual cells encased in durable hard rubber. Crafted by Exide, her main electric propulsion consisted of 4 General Electric 2-wire direct current motors, each rated at 1,375 horsepower, working through a reduction gear that delivered 2,740 horsepower through 2 propeller shafts. This powerful configuration allowed Bofin to achieve a combined output of approximately 5,400 horsepower when surfaced and 2,740 horsepower while submerged, enabling her to reach speeds of 20 knots on the surface and 9 knots underwater. Additionally, Bofin was equipped to carry 24 Mark 14 torpedoes and featured a 4-inch 50 caliber Mark 12 deck gun positioned forward of the conning tower. This dual-purpose 50 caliber weapon system was effective for engaging surface targets, though it was relatively light, reflecting the balance of power that defined naval warfare of the era. Her main anti-aircraft defense was 2 20mm Mark V guns mounted forward and aft of her bridge deck. The sub's conning tower would have an improved design from the previous Salmon and Gato-class submarines, with a shorter fairwater and bridge compared to the conning tower used on the then refitted Salmon and Gato-class subs. Bofin was commissioned in Portsmouth, New Hampshire on May 1, 1943. She would then sail from the East Coast down to Panama and then cross the Pacific to the Australian port of Brisbane, where on August 25, 1943, USS Bowfin would leave Brisbane to begin her first war patrol. It would end up becoming one of her most successful war patrols, joining with fellow submarine USS Billfish SS-286 during the patrol. By the beginning of her 6th patrol, Bowfin had covered 56,687 miles and was credited with sinking 10 large ships, as well as 24 smaller craft, and 1 craft supposedly claimed, but never officially credited, to be sunk on Bowfin's 5th war patrol. Under the command of John Corbis, Bowfin would start her 6th war patrol on July 16, 1944, where she would leave Pearl Harbor and sail into the Ryukyu Islands into Imperial waters. Bofin's radar would track a convoy down, consisting of a fair-sized ship, accompanied by 2 or 3 smaller ships at a range of 14,800 yards. The ships would not be picked up visually until the range between them was 8,000 yards. The crew calculated the ship headed towards Minami Daitojima, an island southeast of Okinawa, and is the largest of the Daito Islands. The crew decided that they would track the convoy until they were moored or had cleared the islands. It was hazy that night, making visibility poor, and 2 hours later, at 22:34, radar would detect a target at 8,900 yards, which ended up being a trawler or a sampan. 2 smaller craft would accompany the boat as well, cruising at a speed of 7 knots, also headed for Kaida Daitojima. At 23:30, the crew switched their focus onto the first convoy to make sure that they didn't slip away. The next day, on August 10th, Bowfin was patrolling Minami Daitojima, where she completed a sweep to the south of the island at 0120. No contacts were detected, but as it turned out, the first convoy had anchored off the western side of the island. Bowfin would then go on to pursuit, with Commander Corbis planning to make a submerged reconnaissance run. However, at 0205, false contacts on Bowfin's radar made it hard to determine if there was something there. Ranges varied from 3,600 yards to 4,500 yards, but nothing was spotted by lookouts. At 0451, Bowfin submerged, heading towards the western side of the Minami Daito, closing the gap to 4,000 yards by 0625, with nothing present. At 0715, as the sun was starting to rise, a trawler escort and a small merchant ship was spotted at a range of 5,000 yards. Immediately, another small merchant ship was spotted at 4,500 yards, sailing on the same course as the escort trawler. Battle Station's torpedo was called immediately after. As Bofin closed on the 3 ships into the harbor, 2 of the ships then tied up alongside a pier. Corbus decided to try and get all 3 ships if they moored alongside the concrete dock. At 0813, the last of the 3 ships anchored off the pier, and at 0849, Bofin increased speed, leaving the anchored ship and pursuing the 2 ships at the dock, with the ships appearing to be riding high in the water, with the estimate of the target ships being 200 feet long and with a draft of only 6 feet, weighing 1,000 tons. At 0919, Bofin was in position 1,750 yards from the anchored ship. The first 3 torpedoes on the bow tubes would be set to a depth of 2 feet due to the small length of the target ship, and at 0923, the 3 torpedoes were launched and started their journey to the target. The first torpedo would miss, passing behind the stern of the ship, eventually exploding on the beach. The second torpedo would hit the port side of the bow, tearing the ship apart, and would sink. The third torpedo wasn't observed due to a loss of depth control, but was believed to be an erratic run. At 0929, the remaining 3 torpedoes loaded in the bow tubes were launched at a range of 1150 yards. All 3 torpedoes hit their mark, and the explosions were devastating. The dock was obliterated, debris was flung 200 feet into the air, and a bus that was on the pier loading personnel was crushed by the falling debris, and a crane on the dock was blown off completely and destroyed, making the USS Bowfin the only submarine with a battle flag that includes an enemy crane and a bus. After the attack, Bofin turned away and headed back into open water, while also being attacked with depth charges, but the sub would make it out unscathed and would leave the island still submerged and wouldn't surface until the night. USS Bofin is patrolling northeast of Ogunishima. At 0506, the sub dove, where 15 minutes later at 0521, 3 heavy explosions were heard and then noted by the crew. At 0555, Bofin's radar would pick up a pinging sound at a bearing of 305 degrees true. Bofin would then change course to 300 degrees true and would then spot smoke at a bearing of 296 degrees true at 0600. The sea was calm and next to zero movement in the water, with clouds nowhere to be seen, making the conditions perfect for sound detecting, allowing for the sub to track the convoy a lot easier. At 0619, the crew of the Bofin sighted 2 ships at a bearing of 295 degrees. The crew would then dive the sub to 80 feet and set its batteries to all ahead standard, and would change course to close in on the convoy. At 0638, a 3rd ship was spotted and was confirmed to be a 3rd ship after the sonar operator heard a 3rd screw going in the water in the direction of the convoy. With the convoy going at a speed of 9 knots and heading 115 degrees true with a 30 degree zigzag every 5 minutes, the convoy consisted of 2 medium freighters and 1 small frigate, without any escorts sighted, until 0653, when 3 escort destroyers were spotted, which consisted of 1 Minakaze-class destroyer and 2 other destroyers that couldn't be identified. Expecting the convoy to come left before returning to a straight inline course. In response, Bofin would set a course at 235 degrees true in order to have a 60 degree port track on the convoy. The plan would be to hit the 2 right-hand ships in the convoy once the convoy returned to their original course. However, they would zigzag back to a course of 145 degrees, making a torpedo run take up more time. Trying to remain undetected, the crew would make a huge error, and the sub's depth control would be lost. In response, the crew took the sub under and would stay there for about 4 minutes. At 0700, one of the escort's destroyers would make a sudden turn, while also activating its sonar and begin echo ranging, trying to find the intruder lurking in their waters. Not picking up anything, the destroyer would return with the convoy on its projected course. At 0707, Bofin would ascend to periscope depth, keeping track of the target ahead. The convoy would make a course change again to 145 degrees, with including a loss of depth control, while making a turn over the course of 4 minutes made it almost impossible for a torpedo attack. Once the convoy made an additional 30-degree turn, the convoy's chances of survival were pretty much guaranteed, and the Bofin would let the convoy go. For the crew of the Bofin as well as Commander Corbus, morale was low, considering that the sub had what appeared to be a good attack position on the enemy convoy, just to have it slip away after a major error with the loss of depth control. The cause of the loss of depth control, however, is unknown. At 0755, 2 enemy aircraft would be spotted heading straight for the Bofin, closing in at a low altitude. With quick acting, the crew would dive deep for about 20 minutes trying to stay undetected. Fortunately, never detected, the ship would ascend back to periscope depth once the intruders were gone. At 0840, smoke would be sighted in the vicinity of Lieshima on a southerly course. All ahead standard was called, and the sub would begin its approach. At 0908, pinging could be heard from the direction of the smoke, most likely coming from an escort using its sonar. The crew would dive the sub down to 80 feet, while keeping the batteries at standard, while also conducting observations on the enemy convoy, but in the end would be unable to close up to the convoy to try and make an attack run. With the convoy turning steadily to the right, the crew believed the convoy was headed for Nahako in Okinawa, or would pass to the west. Once again at 1220, the Bofin would let a second convoy go untouched, after the sonar pings and smoke from the ship's smokestacks could not be observed. The crew kept the Bofin submerged beneath the calm glassy water until 1956, when she surfaced after 14 hours and 50 minutes underwater. Morale was understandably low, having let 2 enemy ships slip by without inflicting any damage. However, the crew's resolve remained unbroken. They were determined that the next encounter would have a far different outcome. It was evening when boarding began. Passengers slowly made their way from the police station in Naha Port to the small loading boats, which would ferry them out to the Tsushima Maru anchored offshore. The ship's previous voyage had been one of military transport, carrying 3,339 soldiers and 600 horses from the 62nd Infantry Division of the Imperial Japanese Army from Shanghai to Okinawa as part of Convoy 609 between August 16 and August 19, 1944. This time, the Tsushima Maru was tasked with a very different mission, evacuating civilians out of Okinawa, and was to sail to Kagoshima as the rapid advance of Allied forces made the situation in Okinawa and the Ryukyu Islands get increasingly dire. About half of these included hundreds of school children from 8 different schools in the Naha district. Once they got to the ship, they had to climb up a ladder in order to get to the deck. At first, children were overwhelmed when they had to climb the ladder, but once they got to the deck, they felt excited and felt safe to be aboard the ship. For the few parents that knew the dangers of oceanic travel during an ongoing war, for some, however, having the opportunity to go to the Japanese mainland, albeit during wartime conditions and while evacuations were being conducted, trumped the dangers of getting there. While some were excited to go to mainland Japan, others were not as enthusiastic. Some didn't want to leave their homes, and some believed the necessary passage on an evacuation ship would have been better if a warship was used. For the voyage, the convoy, designated NAMO 103, set sail under a carefully planned formation, comprising of 5 ships. At its core were 3 cargo vessels, the Tsushima Maru, Kazura Maru acting as a hospital ship, and the Gyoku Maru, accompanied by 2 escort ships, the Momi-class destroyer Hasu and the Yuji, a Hashidate-class gunboat. Aboard the Tsushima Maru alone, were 1,788 individuals, including 826 school children ranging from elementary to high school students, as well as 741 adults, among them teachers and parents who accompanied the children. And the vessel was staffed by a crew of 45. The ship's accommodations were lacking to say the least. No one could bring anything, just themselves and the clothes they wore. The cargo ship's accommodations reflected her use as a troop transport. In order to accommodate the large amounts of people aboard, her cargo holds were outfitted with what was called cabin areas or cabin spaces, which consisted of a short bunk bed-like configuration, made entirely out of wood. Survivors revealed that after they boarded the ship and descended into the cargo holds, they found out that the school evacuees and the family evacuees' quarters were to be segregated. Whoever was able to get the few cabins in the ship's superstructure, which could only hold up to 8 passengers in a peacetime configuration, was never recorded. The cargo holds didn't have any windows, and the ventilation was poor, making it feel as if they were in a sauna rather than a ship. When you add the life vests being required to be worn during the voyage, the cabin environment was poor to say the least. The convoy departed Naha Port at 1835, sailing in a protective formation. At the front were the Tsushima Maru and the Kazura Maru, positioned 1,000 meters apart, with the Gyoku Maru following 600 meters behind. Flanking the Gyoku Maru were the Yuji and Hasu. Despite the seemingly well-organized arrangement, a critical oversight had been made. There was no communication sent to the International Red Cross in Switzerland regarding the convoy's passage. As a result, American submarines patrolling the area were unaware of the convoy's presence, nor were they informed that the Tsushima Maru was carrying evacuees, many of them being school children. This lapse in communication left the convoy dangerously exposed, increasing the risk that it might be mistaken for a military target due to the absence of proper identification. What makes this particularly perplexing is that the Japanese army were well aware of the procedures of negotiating safe conduct clearances for civilian ships, having already secured safe passage for at least 5 other vessels by this point. It seems bizarre that, despite this knowledge, no effort was made to ensure that the same protection for the convoy, given the 300-mile voyage ahead. USS Bofin is conducting its patrol south of Tsushima. Since the 19th, the submarine had encountered little activity, making for 3 uneventful days. That all changed at 0410 on the 22nd, when radar picked up 3 contacts at a bearing of 111 degrees true at a range of 26,000 yards. The crew quickly confirmed the presence of a legitimate convoy. As they tracked the vessels, they identified 2 escorts, and their suspicions were confirmed. This was no false alarm. With dawn breaking at 0500, the crew noted the potential threat of Toroshima's lookout stations and numerous nearby airfields. They assessed the convoy's likely course, anticipating a direct northerly heading with no zigzag pattern. Given the circumstances, should the situation call for diving, the plan was to trail the convoy and set up for a nighttime attack. At 0632, a patrol plane appeared ahead of the convoy, likely conducting an ASW patrol. Despite its proximity, the aircraft failed to detect Bofin, allowing the submarine to maintain its stealthy position. At 0653, with the convoy now closing in, Bofin dove to periscope depth, positioning itself northeast of the convoy's track at a range of 26,500 yards. With the convoy maintaining a steady speed of 9 knots, the gap gradually closed, bringing the distance down to 20,000 yards by 0722. As it was in late August, the hot temperatures as well as poor living conditions of the cabin areas on the Tsushima Maru, it quickly became apparent that it was going to be hard and a very appalling voyage. There were 800 people in the cargo hold, and with the body heat and breathing being emitted by all the people being in the hold, and their food was served in the holds due to the amount of people on the ship, I could only imagine how bad it must have gotten throughout the day. By the morning of August 22nd, Convoy Namo 103 had entered the war zone. The order was then given for all occupants to put on their life vests and put them on at all times, as there was also a typhoon that had been closing in on the convoy's path during the voyage. This made the waves get more choppy and also made many of the children seasick. Meanwhile, Bofin kept running at high speed to close on the distance of the convoy for over an hour. Eventually, Bofin would close the gap down to 5,500 yards, which gave Commander John Corbus a new perfect view of the convoy, spotting the convoy sailing in two columns, with 1,000 meters separating the two leading ships, with the Tsushima Maru leading the left column and the Kazura Maru being the hospital ship leading the right column, with the middle ship being the Gyoku Maru and the destroyer Hasu and the gunboat Uji bringing up the rear. At 10:34, visual contact with the convoy and the air screen was lost. The sub would surface and would head west at flank speed. Commander Corbus decided that he wouldn't dive until the air screen had closed to within 8 miles of the sub, and that was considered the closest Bofin could get without being detected. At 11:23, however, one plane did get to 8 miles and diving was conducted. Just prior to diving, another hint regarding the surface detection radar displayed a theory that the patrolling aircraft might have had a jamming device due to heavy interference being noted on their SDR screen. Bofin stayed under the waves until 12:54 when the coast was clear. She then surfaced and began her chase once again at flank speed. By this time, the gap between the convoy and the Bofin was at 42,000 to 45,000 yards. At 16:28, there was trouble. A trawler had been sighted. Now, this may not seem as a big deal, but given how even the most innocent Japanese ships and boats had ways to warn other ships in the area of an American submarine, caution was taken. Bofin went around the trawler, and Commander Corbus and others thinking that their cover would be blown, though this would not be the case. At 18:36, radar reported contacts from 13 to 6.5 miles, and with that, the order was given to submerge. By this time, Bofin was well ahead of the convoy, and by 1958, due to multiple factors, Bofin would have 2 hours to make her attack run. They also had the factor of the moon giving off too much light for a perfect night attack. With those factors recognized, the decision was made to begin the attack run at 21:30. At 20:21, Bofin's radar would pick up the 3 coal burners in the convoy. With calculations done, the crew determined that the convoy was sailing at 9 knots, the exact top speed of the Bofin, while she was submerged. This meant that Bofin could only keep up with the convoy at her submerged top speed. At 20:39, Bofin was 7 miles from the island of Tairajima and had gained a sufficient lead on the convoy that the order was given to slow the sub down to standard speed, which was around 5 knots. By 2053, the sky had gotten dark enough for a sufficient attack, and at 21:05, the left column of Convoy Namo 103 was off the port side of the bow, at a range of 21,600 yards, and at 21:07, battle stations was ordered. The plan was to attack the closest ship, that being the Tsushima Maru at a range of 13,500 yards, firing all 6 of Bofin's bow tubes before making a 180-degree turn to then fire the 4 stern torpedo tubes. By 21:22, the gap had closed to 10,000 yards, and then to 8,400 yards by 21:30, and at 21:32, the Tsushima Maru changed course, which put the Bofin in a dangerous position. Commander Corbus on Bofin then ordered a turn to starboard at full speed to make up the distance and then come in for another attack. With the island of Tyrajima being behind the Bofin, it provided a dark background which basically camouflaged the Bofin and allowed her to get close to the convoy without being detected. Between 2140 and 2150, the convoy zigzagged, with each ship making a 40-degree course change with each zig made. Due to this, Bofin had to do the same in order to stay in a possible firing position. All tubes were loaded with torpedoes, the hatches were closed, and the bow tubes were flooded. At 2206, each ship was located using the attack periscope. Bofin was 4,800 yards from the Tsushima Maru, and at 2209, Bofin fired her forward torpedoes, each at 8-second intervals, at a range of 2,800 yards. Immediately at 2010, Commander Corbus ordered full right rudder to change position to allow Bofin's aft tubes to fire. On board the Tsushima Maru, even the night couldn't help the heat problem. Most of the school children were in the cargo holds fast asleep, all having to wear their life jackets. The ones that weren't asleep snuck up to the main deck to watch the stars in the clear night sky. Some even slept on the main deck to escape the heat, and some would sleep in the walkways of the main deck, as well as the ship's long, wide corridors. Little did they know what was about to befall them. With the torpedoes swimming through the water, the first 2 torpedoes would pass in front of the Tsushima Maru's bow. Instead, those torpedoes struck the port side of the Gyoku Maru at 22:11 and 18 seconds. Great clouds of smoke were observed, but the ship didn't sink. At 22:11 and 36 seconds, the 4th torpedo struck the port side of the Tsushima Maru, just behind the bridge. The 5th torpedo would then strike the Tsushima Maru behind the bridge at 22:11 and 42 seconds. The second hit would end up breaking the ship's back. Aboard the Tsushima Maru, power was lost and the lights went dark. Those who did wake up from the explosions raced to the ladders to climb up the main deck. Some were running across the deck, others were yelling for their parents or for their teachers. Their teachers tried to direct the children by shouting to try and get them up to the main deck, since they didn't have any flashlights. After a few minutes since the torpedo struck, the order was given to abandon ship. Army soldiers started throwing rafts into the sea, and many children jumped. Those who didn't jump were instead thrown into the sea by army personnel. Debris was everywhere. Those who were in the water tried grabbing onto the wooden rafts, while others ended up drowning in the shark-infested waters. The Hasu and the Uji, suspecting that they were next to be engaged, made no attempt to try and drive off the Bofin. Due to this, Bofin was able to engage the Kazura Maru, and at 22:12 and 26 seconds, Bofin launched her stern torpedoes at the Kazura Maru. At 22:16 and 10 seconds, Kazura Maru took a hit from one of the torpedoes at the stern, and a fire broke out, but the ship would end up surviving this engagement. At 22:18, the Tsushima Maru, while burning fiercely, was down by the stern, with her bow high in the air, and at 22:11, the Tsushima Maru's boilers exploded, and fire raged aboard the ship until they went out once they reached the water, and the Tsushima Maru then slipped beneath the waves, and all visual and radar contacts were lost. No more engagements were made by Bofin, as by that time the submarine left the area, and the engagement of Convoy Namo 103 came to an end. For the few that did survive the sinking, they had to deal with crashing waves as the typhoon approached. By sunrise the next morning, many became exhausted, and some would eventually sink to the bottom. For food, they had to rely on the fish around them, but there was no drinking water around. Although some did try to drink seawater as a substitute, which they would either immediately spit out or would end up consuming. Testimonies from survivors decades later revealed how many people became sick and even vomited while drifting, hoping that someone would rescue them. 3 days after the sinking, some of the survivors started getting rescued. These included patrol boats and fishing boats that were in the area, as well as aircraft that had spotted them drifting in the water. Some survivors would drift at sea for as long as 6 days before being rescued, and dead bodies started drifting ashore on several different islands. For the survivors that were rescued, some would be taken to Kagoshima, where a gag order would be enforced on the remaining survivors. They were not allowed to talk about what happened, and the parents of the children were never notified of what happened. This was done to prevent morale from depleting, as Japanese authorities did not want word to spread about what happened, which would cause that effect. It wouldn't be until after the war that relatives of the deceased were notified about the sinking and of their loss.